Rabosai, we're just going to go over the Brisa in more detail that we were studying yesterday. The Brisa had taken the pasuk of Mipnei Seifa Takum V'Hadarta Pnei Zakein V'Yoresa Me Elokecha Ani Hashem, which is to rise for an elderly person and give glory to an elder and fear your God, I am Hashem. The Brisa had derived a number of halachos based on the verbiage of that pasuk, and we're going to go through each line accordingly. Amar Mar Yachol Yahadrenu B'Mamon Tamulomar Takum V'Hadarta Makima Shein Bo Chisaron Kis Afhider Shein Bo Chisaron Kis. That's one line from the Brisa. It's on DAF Lamed Gimel Lamed Aleph. Sorry. So the Brisa had said you might think that when the Torah says glorify an elder, it means that you have to have out-of-pocket expense in order to do that. That's why the Torah puts the verb of rising and glorifying adjacent to each other, to teach you that just like there's no obligation to incur expense to stand for someone, so too the term glorify, to be mahader, does not mean to incur any additional expense. So the Gemara's question now is, Vikima lesba chisaron kis? Welcome back to Mr. Friedman. It's good to have you back. So the Gemara's question is, you mean to tell me that there's no out-of-pocket expense by standing? I can easily show you that there is. Milo askinan de kanakiv marganisa adahachi v'hachi kayim mikameu batum mimalachto. What about a person who's a jeweler and he's professionally stringing pearls? So he's got to drill a hole in the pearl. And all of a sudden, he's doing this very, very precise kind of artisanship. And all of a sudden, an elder walks by. He's got to interrupt his whole malacha, stand up, and he's losing a tremendous amount of money because every minute is precious for him in this malacha. So you see that standing could cause you loss of money. So the Gemara says you're right. It's a little bit more complex than we had originally thought. Ela akish kima lihidur. Ma hidur she'en bo bittul, av kima she'en bo bittul, ve'akish nami hidur lekima. Ma kima she'en bo chisaron kis, av hidur she'en bo chisaron kis. So the Gemara says it's actually a reciprocal connection. First, we connect standing to glorifying. The term to be mahader implies that you're doing something honorific to someone else, but doesn't imply that you have to actually stop working in order to do that. You either shower a person with gifts, or you smile at them and you say nice things to them, but not in the context of your work. So therefore, since hidur implies not during work, kima also implies not during work. And once I know that kima, standing, is not during work, so then there's no out-of-pocket expense because you're not standing when you don't have to stand if you're working. So therefore, hidur also, going back reciprocally, means that when you show glory to an elder, it does not have to cost you any money. And Mikan Amru, Ein Bali Umnios Rishayin Lama B'nei Talmidei Chachamim B'Shah Sha'oskim B'Malachtam. From here, the rabbis taught us that if you're working for someone else, you can't excuse yourself from your work by saying, I need to stand up for an elder. No, when you're working, you're patur, and you're not even allowed to stand up and interrupt your work if you're doing the work for another. So the Gemara now says, V'lo, V'hatznan kol Bali Umnios Omnim Mipneihem V'Sholem B'Shlomim V'Ormim Lahem Achenu Anshe Makom Ploni Bo'achem L'Sholom. Let me show you a Mishnah in Bechora, in Maseches Bikurim. It says over there that when the people of Yerushalayim would see different people from different communities coming to bring their baskets of fruit, so if a guy was working in the shuk in Yerushalayim, he would have to stand up, interrupt his work, and say, welcome my friends from Tzfat or from Haifa, and welcome to Yerushalayim. Now, according to what you've just told me, if you don't have to show glory to an elder, why should you have to show glory and interrupt your work for someone bringing a basket of fruits? So, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Mipneihem omdim, mipnei talmidei chachamim ein omdim. So Rabbi Yochanan explained, you only have to stand up for these people, but you don't stand up for an elder. So apparently, a person bringing his bikurim is more important even than a Talmud Chacham that's passing by. Am Rabbi Yossi bar Abin boer kama chaviva mitzvah b'shaita sher mipneim omdim mibei talmidei chachamim ein omdim. And this is what Rabbi Yossi says. He says, you see how important and precious to Hashem a mitzvah being done properly in its proper time is that it's even more important than showing honor to a Talmid Chacham is showing honor to a person who's doing a mitzvah at the proper time. But the Gemara says maybe that's not so indicated, because v'dil mashayni hasam dim kenata machshilan la'asid lavo. Maybe really a person doing a mitzvah in a proper time is not so important. But here the rabbis made a special requirement to stand. Why? Because so as not to create a disincentive for the next time. Because just imagine for a second, I schlepped all the way from Haifa to Yerushalayim. It took me 2 weeks on a donkey to get there, right? And I get to the shuk in Yerushalayim, and everyone's just minding their own business and totally ignoring me. No shalom aleichem, no welcome. I'm not going to bother. If a bizyonus I don't need, I'm not going to come next year. So the rabbis didn't want people to have that attitude, so therefore they said, if you live in Yerushalayim, you have to make sure that you're excessively welcoming to the people that come. It's a good reminder for us when people walk into our shul. Just remember this. Amar Mar, Yachol Yamod Mipanav Mibeis Akis Mibeis Hamerchatz. So the next part of the brisa says that you might think that even if you're sitting on the toilet or in the bathhouse, and an elder walks by, that you'd have an obligation to stand up. So the Torah therefore says, takum v'hadarta, that the only time you're required to stand up is if it's an act of glory or respect for the elder. I got news for you. If you're standing up then, it ain't glorious. You might think otherwise, but I guarantee you it's not glorious. Now, so the Gemara now says, v'lo, v'haribchia hava yasiv bei maschusa v'chalev ha'azl Reb Shimon bar Rabbi v'lo kami kamei v'ikbid v'asa amar le'le'avua shnei chumashim shanisi lo b'sefer tehillim v'lo amad mipanai. So he says, let me tell you a story. You know, there's a lot of stories like this in the Gemara. There's a certain rivalry between Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Shimon, who was Rebbe's son, because Rabbi Chia was Rebbe's premier student, and Rabbi Shimon was his son. So there was a little bit of, maybe a little bit of rivalry. This was one example. Rabbi Chia was in the bathhouse. Rabbi Shimon, Rebbe's son, walks by, and Rabbi Chia doesn't get out of the bathhouse to stand up for him. So Rabbi Shimon is a little bit offended. And he comes and he tells his father, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, he says, I taught Reb Chia 2/5 of Sefer Tehillim with all of the Agadita, and he didn't show me proper respect. Visu bar kapara v'amri lo Reb Shmuel bar Reb Yossi have a Yasiv bei maschusa all v'azl Reb Shimon bar Rebbe v'lo kami kamei v'ikbid v'as amar le lavua shnei shlish shanisi lo b'taras kohanim v'lo amad mipanai. And the similar incident happened when either it's Bar Kapara or Reb Shmuel was in the bathhouse. Reb Shimon's walking by, and he was also upset that this sage did not stand up for him. He went back to his father. He says, I taught 2/9 of Sefer Vayikra with all of the Medrash and Agadita to him, and he didn't show me proper covet. He didn't stand up for me. So Va'omar lo. So what did Rebbe respond in defending his Talmidim? He said, Shema bahen yoshev umaharher. Maybe because you had just taught them these texts, they were so engrossed in reviewing the texts that you had taught them that they didn't even notice that you were there. So, Rebbe typically, wants to try and make shalom. So the Gemara says, Taima dibahen yoshev umaharher halav hachi lo. So it sounds like that if it wasn't for that excuse that they were so engrossed in their studies, then it would have been necessary for them to stand.
This is in a bathhouse?
In a bathhouse.
Use mahar hair.
So 1 second. Oh. Very, very good question. So the Gemara says, but you see that it sounds like you would have to stand up in a bathhouse. So the Gemara says, Lo kasha, habavate gavoy, habavate baroi. There are two parts to the bathhouse. There's the bathhouse with the actual water, and then there's the outer changing room. So this happened when they were in the outer changing room, that they didn't stand up, and that's why Reb Shimon was upset. But we're talking about when you're in inside, where the bath actually is, that's where everyone acknowledges that you don't have to stand up. Hachanami mistavra, the Amar Rabba bar Barchana, Amar Rabbi Yechanan, b'chol makom mutar lahayr chutz mi beis hamer, chutz mi beis hakisei. And that's only logical based on what Gershon just said. If it was in the inner part of the bathhouse, we know that you're not allowed to think words of Torah when you're in the inner bathhouse. So that proves that they must have been in the outer bathhouse. And the Gemara says that's not really such a solid proof, because Dilma la'on se shiny. Because maybe while it's true that you're not allowed to think words of Torah in the bathhouse, but if you just went to a shiur and then you go take a bath, sometimes you can't help it. Sometimes you're so overtaken by the information that you can't help but think about those words. And so, in other words, if that's your only proof, that's not a proof. But the bottom line is that the Gemara stands by its answer that in the inner bathhouse you definitely don't stand for a Talmud Chacham. The next line of the Brisa said that you might think that if you see an elder coming towards you, that you're allowed to close your eyes and pretend you don't see him. And therefore the Torah says at the end of the Pasuk, V'yareisa me'elokecha ani Hashem, fear your God, because God says, I know what's in your heart. I know whether you really saw him or not. So the Gemara's first question is, Atu b'Rashi Askina? He says, why does the Torah have to address Rishayim? I mean, what a person's going to say, I know I have a chiyuv, but I refuse to do it, and I'm going to pretend. Why would the Torah need to address a Rasha? The Torah should only address people who want to fulfill the Torah. So the Gemara answers, you're right. Ela yachol yatzim einav mikamei delim taye zman chiyuva. D'chimat zman chiyuva halochazi le dekoy mikamei tamulomer takum v'yoresa. But rather, what the person whom the Torah is addressing is the person who sees the Talmud Chacham coming from a distance. And we know that you only have an obligation to rise when he comes within your Dalet Amos. So a guy says to himself, Oi, I see Rabbi so-and-so coming, I'll pretend that I'm engrossed in learning, and Itaka will become so engrossed that I won't see him when Itaka comes within my Dalet Amos, and I'll be putter. In other words, halachically, I seek to exempt myself from having to stand by so engrossing myself in something else that Itaka won't see him when he walks by. And that's why the Torah says, V'yares Melkecha. No, you have to actually anticipate the becoming chayiv in the mitzvah. Tana, Ezohi Kima Sheyesh B'Hider, Haviomer Zed Dalet Amos. What is the proper standing for a Talmud Chacham that involves glorifying him? Only when he's within your Dalet Amos, because then it's indicated from the fact that you're standing at that moment that you're doing it for him. But Amar Abaya lo Amran Ela Barabo Shenamuvak Aval Barabo Hamuvak Malo Einav. But that's only when he's not your personal mentor. But if he's your personal mentor, and the poskim say also if he's your Rosh Yeshiva, so then you have to stand up, even if he's at a distance. As long as you can see him, you have to stand up from that point onwards until he passes by. Abaya Mechi Havachazi, I still remember it clear as day when Rav Ruderman Zichrono Livracha would walk into the Beis Medrash. The entire Beis Medrash would stand up for him and wait, because he walked very slowly. He was quite elderly, and would until he got to his seat. Abaya Mechi Havachazi Le Leudnei Dechamer de Rav Yosef Daasi Havakoim. That Abaya, even if he would just see the ear of the donkey of his Rebbe coming, immediately he would stand. So Abaya Havarachiv Chamer Bekomaski Aguda Dinar. Now Abaya, later in life, he now is the Rosh Yeshiva, and he's on his donkey by the river bank, and Dinahar Sagya, Yasiv Rav Misharshi of Rabbanan Beidach Yisav Lo Kama Mikamei. And he noticed that there were other rabbis on the other side of the riverbank. Granted, it was more than Dalet Amos on the other side, but the halacha is that they have to stand up for him, but they weren't. Amr lahu v'lav Rav Muvak Ana, Amru lei lav adaitin. So he said, well, why aren't you guys standing? I'm the Rosh Yeshiva. So they said back, we're sorry, Rebbe, we didn't even notice you. Apparently they were so engrossed in the learning, they didn't notice. Okay, let's go weiter. Rav Shimon ben Elazar Omer, Minayin lezaken shelo yatriach tamulam or zaken v'yares. The next line of the Brisa had said that how do you know that even though people have to stand for an elder, but if you are the elder, you have to have consideration for people, and if you can circumvent them and not require them to stand, you have to do that. And that's why the Torah puts the word zaken right before the words v'yares elokecha. That even the zaken has to be reverential towards Hashem and have consideration for Hashem's creatures. Amar Abaye naktinan de'imakiv chaye. And we have a tradition that any Talmud Chacham who tries to circumvent making people stand will have a long life. Abaya Makif, Reb Zeir Makif, and that's why Abaya did that and Reb Zeir did that. Ravina Ava Yosef Kamei de Reb Yirmiyah Midifti. Now, a related story. This is not a case of an elder scribe, an elder scholar circumventing the crowd. It's really a story of a person showing a certain disregard for Talmidei Chachamim. Ravina was sitting in front of Reb Yirmiyah. They were studying Torah. a certain very boorish kind of person walks by without a head covering, so clearly he's sort of like an Am Haaretz. Amar Kama Chotzif Hagavra. So one sage turns to the other. Ravina turns to Rabbi Yirmiyah and says, look at him, such a machutzev, such a brazen person, just walking right past us without showing us any honor. So Rabbi Yirmiyah says, no, you should be dan lekaf schus. The guy may come from a town called Masa Machasya, where rabbis are a dime a dozen. In other words, there are, there's so many rabbanim in that city that they're so familiar with them that they don't give it a second thought to interact with them on a regular basis. Isi ben Yehuda Omer Mipnei Seva Takum Bafilu Kol Seva V'Mashma. And then we got to the Isi ben Yehuda. The first two opinions in the Brisa said the only time you're obligated to stand is for an elder who's also a Talmud Chacham. But if he's an elder who's a bor, you don't have to stand for him. Isi ben Yehuda disagrees, and he says, no, any person who's an elder you have to stand up for, even if he's in total Am Haaretz. Amar Rabbi Yochanan halacha ke'isi ben Yehuda. And Rabbi Yochanan says that's taka how we paskin. And Rabbi Yochanan havakoi mikamei saba de armoi. Amar kama harpatiki adu alaihu dahani. Now it's interesting. Rabbi Yochanan reflects, and he says once he's in front of a group of elder Arameans. These are non-Jews, and he said, you know what? You still have to show them kavod. You know why? They've had certain life experiences that I've never had. And with life experience, no matter whether you've studied Torah or not, comes wisdom, and we have to appreciate that with age comes wisdom. It's like the Satmar Rebbe said, when people came to him and said, Rebbe, who should we ask our shilas to? He said, anyone who has a number on his arm, you should ask. You can go to and ask for a bracha, right? Who should we go to for brachas? In other words, people go through difficult knocks of the hard knocks of life. They don't have to be a scholar. You should respect them for what they've gone through in life. Rava mekam lokoi, but hidur avid lahu. Rava was not prepared to go that far. He showed respect. He showed some kind of reverence, but he didn't go the full blown standing up for them. Abaya yahiv yada l'sabe. Abaya always used to stick out his hand to help an elderly person if he needed some support, to help walk him across the street or whatever. Rava mishader shluchei. Rava, if he would see an elderly person, would send his shamus to go and help that person. And Rav Nachman mishader gozoi. Amar ilav Torah kama Nachman bar Abba ika b'shuk. And Rav Nachman would send out his one of the ministers in the court of the Reish Galusa where he used to study Torah. He was like sort of the official rabbinic sage of the Reish Galusa, because he said, listen, I would do it myself, but I have to study Torah. Because if it weren't for my Torah study, look how many Nachmans there are in the shuk. So therefore, I have to continue studying, but I want to show honor to these elderly people, so I'll send one of the workers in the Reish Galusa's palace. Amar Rabbi Ivo, Amar Rabbi Yanai, Ein Talmud Chacham Rashai Lamod Mipnei Rabo Ela Shacharis Va'arvis Kidei Shelo Yiyeh Kvodo Meruba Mikavod Shamayim. So he says like this: the Talmud Chacham should not stand more than twice a day for his Rebbe, no matter how many times he sees his Rebbe. Stand up only 2 times. You know why? Because the kavod of your Rebbe should not be greater than the kavod that you have for Hashem. Just like you go greet Hashem and stand for Hashem twice a day. Some people told me that this means Kriya Shema twice a day, but I asked them a question. We don't stand for Kriya Shema. So it makes more sense to me, I could be mistaken, that Shachris and Arvis means Shachris and Mincha. And that you stand for Hashem and Shmona Esrei twice a day, because Ma'ariv is a Rishus, right? That's what I thought it means, but I could be mistaken. But anyway, you show honor to Hashem by standing for Hashem twice a day. Why should you do more for your Rebbe? So, Meisvei, let's ask a kasha. Reb Shimon ben Elazar Omer Minayin L'Zaken Shelo Yatriach Tamul Omar Zaken V'Yaresa V'Yamar Shachris V'Arvis Bilvad Amaylo Nitrach Chiyuvu. So the question is, with the Brisa had said that an elder Talmud Chacham should not be matriach the oilam by walking past them if he can circumvent and not make them stand up. What's the big deal? If they're only standing up twice a day, let him go into the base medrash. They're not going to stand up for him if he's coming constantly in and out. So elalav kulayoma. So doesn't that indicate from the Brisa that they have to stand up every single time they see him, and that's why he should try to circumvent the crowd? Lo laolam shachris varvis bilvad va'afilu hachi kama de'ef shalei lo nitrach. The Gemara says no. It still could be you only have to stand twice a day for your Rebbe, no matter how many times he passes by. But even the twice a day, you should try and avoid to be matriach them if there's any way for you to circumvent. That's a possibility. Tosfos points out something very interesting. He says, the din zeh eino noheg ela ba'osam hadorin beveis harav. The mistama amdu shacharis va'arvis. He says this halacha that the Gemara is suggesting, that you don't have to stand for your Rebbe more than twice a day, only applies if you taka live in the same place as your Rebbe, like you're dorming in the yeshiva. So then you could argue that you see the Rebbe all the time. If you'd have to get up every time you see him, it'll drive you crazy. You won't be able to learn. So that's the reason why. But if you're not living with your Rebbe and you only see him every couple of hours, then even 100 times you'd have to stand up for him every single time you see him. Amar Rabbi Lazar, Kol Talmud Chacham Shein Omid Mipnei Rabo Nikra Rasha Ve'eno Marach Yamim V'Talmudu Mishlakeach. So Rabbi Lazar says if a Talmud Chacham does not stand for his Rebbe, he's called a Rasha, he will not have long life and his studies will be forgotten. Shenamar, as the pasuk says in Koheles, V'tov lo yihi el Rasha V'lo ya'arich yamim ketzeal asher einenu yarei milifnei ha'elokim. That there will not be goodness for the wicked person, and he will not have length of days. His life will be like a shadow, because he does not show fear before Hashem. And before Hashem could also be read as before Ha'elokim, meaning the judges, the elders. So morazu eini yodeya mahu. What does it mean he doesn't show fear? So kishu omer v'yaresa me'elokecha hare morazu kima. So the last part of the pasuk of Nei Seva Takum says v'yaresa me'elokecha. So you see that yira means rising for an elder. But the Gemara says, wait a minute, ve'ema mora'as ribis u'mora'as mishkalos. But the pasuk also says v'yaresa me'elokecha, by the law of ribis in the Torah and by the law of proper weights and measures in the Torah. So how do you know that this person will not have length of days because he didn't stand before an elder? Maybe he didn't observe ribis properly. So Rebbe Lazar Pinei Gomar. So the Gemara's answer is that Rebbe Lazar derives it not only from the word yira, but also both psukim have the word panim. It says mipinei seva takum v'hadarta pinei zakein, and it also says in the pasuk in Koheles asher einenu yarei milifnei ha'elokim. So the word pinei is mentioned in both, and that's really what connects the two. Ibayalahu benovahu rabo mahu lamod mipnei aviv. Mari asked an interesting question. What if my son is my Rebbe? Does he still have an obligation to stand for me? Okay, so this is the father. So Tashma Amar Le Shmuel Rav Yehuda Shinana Kumi Kamei Avuch. Remember, we learned the story about Rav Yehuda, the son of Rav Yecheskel, that Shmuel would give him musar, show proper honor to your father. And one time he told him, sharp one, you always need to stand in your father's presence. Now, Rav Yehuda clearly, as we learned in yesterday's DAF, was the wiser. He was the bigger Talmud Chacham than his father Rav Yecheskel. So doesn't that indicate that even if I'm my father's superior in learning, that I still have to stand up for him? The Gemara says no. Shiny Rav Yecheskel de bal masim hava da afilu mar Shmuel nami koi mikamei. No, that Rav Yecheskel, even though he may not have been as great of a scholar as Rav Yehuda, but he was a great tzaddik. He did tremendously righteous deeds, and that's the reason why Rav Yehuda had to stand up for him, because even Shmuel stood up for him, Rav Yehuda's Rebbe. But the Gemara says, Elamaika Amarle. Well, then why did Shmuel have to even point it out to him? If Rav Yecheskel was such a tzaddik, why didn't the son Rav Yehuda know that automatically to stand for his father? So the Gemara says, Hachi Kamarle Zimnin da'asi me'achorai kum at mikamei v'lo teichosh liyakarididi. But what Shmuel was telling Rav Yehuda is, listen, I know you're my Talmud, and there may be times when we're learning intensely in the middle of a shir or a chavrusa. Your father, if he ever walks behind me and I don't notice it, don't think that you need to show me honor more than your father. If you ever see your father come, you better stand up for him, even if it means interrupting our learning. That's what he was telling him. Ibayalahu benovahu rabo ma'u sheyamud aviv mipanav. Now let's reverse the question. We've established that a son should stand for his father, or at least we've raised the question that it would seem that even when the son is the Rebbe, as long as his father is a good person, you should stand for him. What about does a father have to stand for his son if his son is his Rebbe? So Tashma Damar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi Ani Eini Kedai Lamod Mipnei Beni Ela Mishum Kavod Beis Nasi. So Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said, I really should not be standing for my son. The only reason I'm standing for him is because he married into a very politically influential family. He married into the Nasi's family, and therefore my standing up for him is to show honor to the Nasi, but not really because of my son. So now the question is like this: Taima da'ana Rabbi, ha'ihu Rabbi ka'imna mikameh. So the Gemara makes the following diuk. The Gemara says, now wait a minute. Really, what Rabbi Shua ben Levi was saying is, I really shouldn't stand for my son because I'm his superior. But it sounds like if my son was my superior, then I would stand up for him, even if he wasn't married to the Nasi. So the Gemara says, no, that doesn't prove anything, because Hachi Kamar, Ani Eini Kedai Lamud B'bnei B'ni Va'afilu Hu Rabbi Daha'ana Avuha Ela Mishum Kabod Beis Nasi. What Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi was saying like this is that it's true, I'm a bigger Talmud Chacham than my son. But even if my son was my Rebbe, I still wouldn't have to stand up for him, because he's my son after all, and a son has to show kavod to his father and not vice versa. But the reason why I stand for him is because of he's married to the Nasi's family. So therefore, Gemara says you can't really infer one way or the other, and it seems like the Rambam paskins that a father never stands up for his son, no matter how much of a Talmud Chacham the son is. Ibayilu.
Yosef came to Yaakov Avinu. Could we darshan anything out of that?
Well, first of all, we don't necessarily see that Yaakov stood up for his son. We don't see that.
Himself. He wasn't ill, wasn't he, at the time? I think.
You mean in Parshas Vayechi?
Maybe a king is different.
The Rashi says, first of all, it could be a king is different, but Rashi says that he was bowing to the Shechina. He wasn't bowing to Yosef.
Oh.
Yeah. Okay, Ibayilu. So now the next question is raised. Rachub kemahalech dami olo. What if you see a Talmud Chacham riding in on a donkey? Do you have to stand up for him, or is the law of standing up for him only when he's standing? And here you could argue that sitting on a donkey is like he's seated, not that he's standing. So Amar Abaye Tashma. So I'll try to prove it to you from the following. Tameh Yoshev Tachas Ilan V'Tahar Omei Tameh. Period. The Mishnah in Negoyim talks about the following scenario. The Mishnah derives from Psukim that a person who has Tumas Tzoras transmits Tumah to others with Tumas Ohel, meaning if you're in the same overhang, provided that the Mitzorah is seated. If the Mitzorah is standing, he does not transmit Tumah to others within his overhang. Okay? So let's say a Mitzorah and a regular guy are standing underneath a tree. So the Mishnah starts off by saying that if the Mitzorah is seated and the other person is standing, so that person becomes Tameh. But Tameh Omei Tachas Ilan V'Tohar Yoshev Tohar. But if it's vice versa, if the Mitzorah is standing and the other guy is seated, he does not become Tameh, he's Tohar. V'im Yashav HaTameh HaTohar Tameh. But if in the middle of this scenario the Mitzorah sits down, then immediately the Tohar person becomes Tameh. V'chein be'even hamenugas. And then the last line is, the same thing is true that when a person is holding a stone that is leprous, even if he himself does not have tsaras, he will only transmit tumah if he is seated while he's holding the stone. But if he's standing while holding the stone, he will not transmit tumah in an ohel. So the Gemara says, "V'amar Rav Nachman bar Kohen zos omeres rachuv k'mahalech dami shma mina." What can we prove from here? Says Rav Nachman. We can prove from here that when you're sitting on an animal, then it's like you're still walking. Now, how do we know this? Well, think about it in this context. The stone is being held as an inanimate object, but if you can imagine the stone as being like a person, the stone is seated. The stone is not walking on its own power. It's being held up by something or someone else, right? By the person. And you look at the stone, if the person is standing, as the stone is standing as well. Not that the stone is seated. And that's why it doesn't transmit tumah if the person holding the stone is standing. So you see that when one object is resting on top of another object, and the bottom object, whether it's a human being or an animal, is standing, since the rider is seated, that's considered to be standing. That's considered to be standing. And therefore, you see from here that you would have to stand up for a person, for a Talmud Chacham who's riding on a donkey. So Ibayalahu Mahu Lamud B'Pnei Sefer Torah. Now this question, of course, we know obviously from halacha, but do you have to stand up when a Sefer Torah passes by? So Reb Chilki of Reb Simon Reb Elazar Amri Kal V'Chomer Mipnei Lomdeha Omdim Mipanei Lo Kol Shekain. Of course, they say, if you have to stand up for a person who studies Torah, then surely you'd have to stand for the Torah scroll itself. Rabbi Eloi v'Rabbi Yaakov bar Zati havu Yasvi Chalafa Azal Reb Shimon bar Abba v'Kamu Mikamei. The Gemara tells us a story that two sages, Rabbi Eloi and Rabbi Yaakov, were sitting studying Torah, and then Reb Shimon bar Abba walks past them. And they stood up, even though they were in the midst of their studying, they stood up to show him kavod. Amar lahu chada da'atun chakimi va'ana chaver. So he says to them, Rabbi Sai, I don't know why you're standing up for me. Number one, you are Talmidei Chachamim, and I'm just a Froma Yid. So I'm not even worthy of your kavod. Second of all, va'od klum Torah omedes mipnei lomdeha. And furthermore, even if you're going to say that I'm a Talmud Chacham as well, but if you're in the midst of active Torah study, since when does a Torah stand up for someone who studies Torah? You're actively studying Torah, so you're like the Torah scroll. I'm walking past. I'm not actively learning Torah now, so why should you stand up for me? Sarvala Kareb Elazar, Damar Reb Elazar, Ein Talmud Chacham, Rishaylam B'nei Rabba, B'Shasha Osek B'Torah. And Reb Shimon clearly held like Reb Elazar, who says that if a Talmud Chacham is studying, he's not allowed to stand up for his Rebbe, because it's going to stare you from your learning. However, La Yitala Abaye. But Abaye was very contemptuous. He was very critical of that shita of Rebbe Elazar, and he held, and that's how we paskin, that even if you're in the midst of study, you still have to stand for your Rebbe. Next, v'hibitu acharei Moshe ad boa ola. We have a little agadita now. The Torah says that the people, when Moshe would go after the Chet HaEgel, when Moshe would go to his special tent, the Torah says that the people gazed at Moshe constantly until he got to his tent. Rabbi Ami v'Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha, chad omer l'genai v'chad omer l'shevach. And there's a machlokes whether this gazing is a criticism of the Jewish people or whether it's to their praise. Man do'amer l'genai k'de'isa. If you learn that it's critical, that's why the Torah does not elaborate on this gazing, but rather just says they gazed at him. But the Medrash tells us, as Rashi quotes, that this was a contemptuous gaze. They would look at Moshe walking past, going to his home, and they would say, looks like Moshe put on a little weight. He must be eating pretty well, that Moshe Rabbeinu. I wonder where he gets that. He's been eating a little bit too much mun, or I think we need to cut back on his paycheck because he's obviously living on the high hog, as they say, right? So that was one way. So that's one way that's one way of understanding how they were looking at this. Never happens, of course, in the modern world. And Mando Amar L'Shevach Amar Chizkiya Amar Li Rabbi Chanina Breder Rabavo Amar Rav Dimi Demin Chaifa Chacham Over Omed Milafan of Dalad Amos V'Kevin Sherma Dalad Amos Yoshev. So if you learn that it's a praise of the Jewish people for standing there and gazing at Moshe until he got to his tent, it's because of the following teaching. That when you have a regular Talmud Chacham, so once he comes within your Dalad Amos, you have to stand, and once he passes, you can sit down. Av Beistin over Omed Milafan of Mulo'ena V'Kevin Sherma Dalad Amos Yoshev. When a person is the head of a Beistin, so then you have to stand for him already just upon sighting him, even at a distance. But once he passes your Dalad Amos, then you could be seated. However, Nasi over Omed Milafanav Molo'ena Vena Yoshev Ad Sheyeshev B'Makomo. But when a Nasi, who's the political leader of the Jewish people, as well as a scholar, when he passes before you, so you have to stand already as soon as you see him, and you can't be seated until you let him, until he goes to his place to rest, to go to be at rest. So therefore, that's why the people stood for Moshe. They gazed at him until he got to his tent, and then they would sit down. Shenamar, as it says, V'bitu acharei Moshe ad bo'ola, as it says that the people gazed at Moshe, meaning that they stood there at attention and at a respectful stance until he would get to his tent. So there's two ways of looking at it. Have a wonderful day.